Hey guys, tonight we're taking a trip, 3 decades, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. 30 years that, depending on when you were born, might be the years you actually lived through, or might be the years your parents won't stop talking about, or might just be the years that built the world you grew up into without you ever quite realizing it. Tonight we're going to walk through all 3. The music that was playing, the jobs people worked, the way people fell in love before any of it happened through a screen, the technology that felt impossibly futuristic at the time and now sits in a drawer somewhere, completely obsolete, completely beloved. This is going to be a long one, and it's going to move fast, and it's going to cover a lot of ground because 30 years is a lot of ground to cover. So get comfortable. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more of this coming. Alright, let's go back. Let's start in the 70s. The year is 1974. You are 17 years old and you are about to start your first job. It's not glamorous. It's never glamorous, the first one. You're bagging groceries at the local supermarket, the kind of place with linoleum floors and a manager who wears a short-sleeved dress shirt with a clip-on tie and a punch clock by the back door that you have to remember to use, or you don't get paid for the time you actually worked. You make a little over $2 an hour, which sounds impossibly small now, and felt, at the time, like the first real money you'd ever had that wasn't an allowance, that wasn't a gift from a relative, that you had actually gone out and earned with your own hands. You remember the uniform, a polyester vest in a colour that doesn't really exist anywhere else in nature, a name tag that the manager hand-wrote because the embossing machine was broken that week. You remember the specific weight of a paper grocery bag once it's loaded properly, the way you learned through trial and error, through a few spectacularly bad early attempts, to put the heavy cans on the bottom and the bread on top, to not put the eggs anywhere near anything that could crush them. You remember your first paycheck, not the amount, particularly the feeling. The specific, unprecedented feeling of holding a piece of paper that existed because you had shown up and worked, and someone had decided that your time was worth something measurable. You probably spent it on something completely unmemorable. Gas for a car that wasn't even yours yet, a record, a meal at a diner with friends. And it didn't matter what you spent it on, because the spending wasn't the point. The earning was the point. The 1970s workplace for someone starting out looked different from anything that came after it in ways that are easy to forget. There was no email, obviously. There wasn't even a fax machine in most ordinary workplaces yet, not until later in the decade. Communication happened on paper, or on the phone, or in person, and if you needed to tell someone something and they weren't there, you left a note, or you waited, or you called back later and hoped they'd be in. The radio was always on somewhere in the background. AM radio, mostly, in a workplace like this. The top 40 stations playing whatever was dominating the charts that particular month, which in the early to mid-70s meant a stretch of music that ranged from the tail end of the singer-songwriter boom to the rise of disco to the continued dominance of classic rock acts who were, at the time, simply rock acts, not yet classic anything. You remember specific songs from specific shifts, the way a song could attach itself permanently to a memory of stocking shelves or running a register, so that decades later, hearing it again in a grocery store or a car or a doctor's office waiting room would instantly transport you back to that exact polyester vest, that exact linoleum floor, that exact 17-year-old version of yourself who had no idea yet what the rest of the decade, let alone the rest of your life, was going to look like. Now let's talk about falling in love in the 1970s, because it happened differently than it happens now, and the difference is worth sitting with. There was no texting. This is the fact that, more than any other, defines the entire emotional landscape of romance in this decade, for anyone trying to explain it to someone younger. If you liked someone, you could not send them a quick, low-stakes message to test the waters. You had 2 real options: call them on the telephone, which in most households meant a phone attached to a wall by a cord, often in a location with limited privacy, often answered first by a parent or a sibling who would then have to go find the person you were actually calling, or you had to see them in person and say something. Both of these options required a level of nerve that the modern world has largely engineered away. Calling a girl's house in 1974 and having her father answer the phone was an experience that an entire generation of people can describe in vivid, slightly traumatized detail. You'd ask as politely as your nervous system allowed whether she was available, and then you would wait, sometimes what felt like an extremely long time, while footsteps moved away from the phone and, eventually, hopefully, came back. If you were dating someone, the dates themselves looked different too. The diner, the drive-in movie if you were lucky enough to live somewhere that still had one, and the decade had not yet finished killing them off. The school dance with its crepe paper streamers and its punch bowl and its slow songs that gave you the one sanctioned opportunity all evening to actually hold the person you liked. Mixtapes did not exist yet in their later cassette-based form. That was coming, toward the end of the decade and into the next, once the cassette technology matured. But the impulse behind the mixtape existed already in the form of records you'd play for someone, songs you'd request be played on the radio in the hope that the person you liked was listening at the same moment you were, in the deeply specific and deeply 1970s experience of slow dancing to a song you'd remember with total clarity for the rest of your life. Love letters were real, physical objects, written by hand, folded and passed in school hallways, or mailed with an actual stamp if the distance required it. There was something in the handwriting itself. The pressure of the pen, the crossed-out words, the specific quality of a teenager's cursive in 1974, that carried information no typed message ever could. You could tell, from a letter, whether the person writing it had been nervous. You could tell from the smudges. Technology in the 1970s was a strange mix of the genuinely revolutionary and the almost prehistoric, often sitting side by side in the same household. Television was color now, in most homes, though some families were still finishing out the useful life of an old black and white set in a back bedroom or a basement rec room. There were, depending on where you lived, somewhere between 3 and 7 channels, and choosing what to watch was a genuine negotiation among everyone in the house, because there was exactly one television in most homes, and it sat in a piece of furniture that often matched the rest of the living room, and changing the channel meant getting up and physically turning a dial. The remote control existed, but was far from universal. And the early remotes that did exist were often clunky, wired affairs, or ultrasonic devices that occasionally got confused by the jingling of keys or the barking of a dog and changed the channel on their own, to the great confusion of whoever was watching. Calculators were becoming consumer products for the first time in the early 70s, and they were expensive enough and novel enough that owning one, particularly a sleek one with a red LED display, was genuinely impressive. The pocket calculator went from a luxury item costing hundreds of dollars at the start of the decade to an affordable, ordinary school supply by the end of it. One of the fastest price collapses of any consumer technology in history up to that point. Music technology was changing fast, too. The 8-track tape, dominant in cars for much of the decade, gave way gradually to the cassette, which was smaller, more reliable, and, crucially, recordable in a way that let ordinary people start making their own compilations, copying songs off the radio, building the foundation of what would become, in the following decade, the full mixtape culture. Home video, the idea of recording a television show to watch later or renting a movie to watch at home, did not yet exist for ordinary consumers. VHS and Betamax were both introduced toward the very end of the decade, in 1975 and 1976 respectively, but they remained expensive and uncommon through the rest of the 70s. If you missed an episode of your favorite show, you missed it. There was no other way to see it except reruns whenever the network decided to air them, on their schedule, not yours. Fashion in the 1970s moved through several distinct phases, and if you lived through the whole decade, you probably wore versions of all of them, sometimes within the same year. The early 70s carried over a lot of the late 60s aesthetic, bell-bottoms, paisley, an overall looseness and earthiness in clothing that reflected the lingering influence of hippie counterculture, even as that counterculture's more political and idealistic edges were softening into something more like a general aesthetic style, available to people who had no particular interest in the politics that originally produced it. By the middle of the decade, disco was reshaping fashion dramatically. Polyester, in colors that ranged from deep jewel tones to genuinely eye-watering brights, became the fabric of choice for anyone going out to dance. Platform shoes added inches to your height and required a genuinely new kind of balance to walk in safely. Wide collars, often worn open to the sternum on men's shirts, paired with gold chains, became a recognizable uniform for a certain kind of going-out look. For women, the decade brought a loosening of structure compared to earlier eras. Fewer girdles, more flowing fabric, the maxi dress as a genuine alternative to the mini that had dominated the previous decade, though both lengths coexisted depending on the occasion and the individual's preference. Hair was big in every sense. The afro, for Black Americans, was both a fashion statement and a political one, a deliberate embrace of natural texture after decades of pressure towards straightening. For white Americans, feathered hair, the kind popularized by television and movie stars of the period, required a blow dryer, a round brush, and considerably more time in front of a bathroom mirror than the previous decade's styles had demanded. The 1970s gave the world the first Earth Day in 1970, and with it, a strain of fashion and culture that emphasized natural materials, denim, earth tones, a kind of back-to-basics aesthetic that ran in parallel with, and sometimes directly against, the synthetic glamour of disco. You could be living in both of these aesthetic worlds simultaneously, wearing denim and flannel to school and platform shoes to the dance on Saturday night. And nobody found this particularly contradictory because it wasn't. It was just the decade, offering multiple ways to dress depending on what you were doing and who you were trying to be that day. The 1980s. The year is 1986. You are 19 years old and you've just started your first real job out of high school. Not the grocery store gig of a few years back, but something with a desk. Or at least the beginning of something with a desk, an entry-level position at a company that makes you feel, for the first time, like an actual adult with an actual career. The fax machine had arrived in full force by now, transforming office communication in a way that for a few years felt genuinely revolutionary. The ability to send an exact copy of a document to someone in another city in minutes rather than days was the email of its moment, and offices reorganized themselves around the fax machine the way later offices would reorganize around email and even later ones around instant messaging. Shoulder pads, power suits. The specific, almost architectural quality of 1980s professional dress, for women especially, who were entering the white-collar workforce in unprecedented numbers and who developed, partly out of necessity and partly as genuine style, a way of dressing for work that visually claimed space and authority in environments that had not been designed with women's authority particularly in mind. Falling in love in the 1980s still required the landline telephone. That part hadn't changed yet, not for most people, not until later in the decade when cordless phones started appearing and gave you slightly more room to wander while you talked, slightly more privacy, the cord no longer tethering you to the kitchen wall. But something new had arrived alongside the old, the mixtape in its full, mature form. The cassette tape, recordable, portable, and, crucially, capable of being filled with exactly the songs you wanted, in exactly the order you wanted them, became the single most important romantic technology of the decade. Making a mixtape for someone you liked was a serious undertaking. You sat by the radio, finger hovering over the record button, waiting for the song you wanted to come on, trying to catch it from the very first note without catching the DJ's voice talking over the intro. The shopping mall became, in this decade, the central social space for a huge number of American teenagers in a way that's hard to fully convey to anyone who didn't experience it. The mall was where you went after school. It was where first dates happened. A movie at the mall theatre, a slice of pizza at the food court, an hour of wandering the record store or the arcade with someone you were trying to work up the nerve to hold hands with. The mall had everything you needed for a teenage social life in one climate-controlled building, and an entire generation's romantic memories are tied up in specific stores, specific food court tables, specific arcade games played side by side with someone whose hand you were extremely aware of the entire time. MTV, launched in 1981, gave music an entirely new visual dimension, and falling in love in the 80s often meant falling in love with specific songs as visual experiences for the first time. The music video as a shared cultural reference point, something you'd watch together if you were lucky enough to be at someone's house when the right video came on, something you'd discuss and dissect the way earlier generations discussed song lyrics alone. Technology in the 1980s moved at a pace that felt, to the people living through it, genuinely dizzying. The personal computer went from a hobbyist novelty to a real consumer product over the course of the decade. The IBM PC arrived in 1981. The Apple Macintosh, with its revolutionary graphical interface and its mouse, an input device that most people had never used and that took a few minutes of fumbling to figure out, arrived in 1984, announced with a Super Bowl commercial that is still studied as one of the most effective pieces of advertising ever made. Video games exploded into mainstream culture.
Jerry, video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too. Millions of people are addicted to hours of gazing at electronic images on game screens in arcades and in their own homes.
It is a cacophony of sounds from a symphony of electronics. If you're filling your time capsules these days, don't forget a bit of Frogger, or Mousetrap, or Grand Champion, or Pac-Man, or Ms. Pac-Man. They are video games. They are as American, well, as international as war.
The arcade was a genuine cultural institution. Dark rooms full of cabinet games, the specific electronic symphony of dozens of different games all making noise simultaneously, the social ritual of putting your quarter on the edge of the screen to claim the next game, the local rankings of who held the high score on which machine, a form of teenage status that mattered enormously within its specific context and meant nothing at all outside it. The home console arrived too and grew through the decade, Atari giving way, after the famous video game crash of 1983, to the Nintendo Entertainment System, which launched in North America in 1985, and which single-handedly revived an industry that many had pronounced dead. Mario, Zelda, Metroid, games that are still, in various forms, being played and remembered 4 decades later, were new and strange and exciting then. Played on a console plugged into the family television, the cartridge blown into and reinserted with the specific ritual that an entire generation remembers with absolute clarity, whether or not it actually did anything technically useful. The Walkman, released by Sony in 1979 but reaching its full cultural saturation through the 1980s, changed the basic experience of listening to music by making it portable and private for the first time in a meaningful way. You could walk down the street, ride the bus, sit through a boring family car trip, all while having your own private soundtrack, completely inaccessible to anyone around you unless you chose to share an earbud. A genuinely intimate gesture in its way, handing someone one half of your headphones and watching their face as they heard what you'd been listening to. The camcorder arrived too, bulky and expensive at first, capturing the birthday parties and the school plays and the family vacations of the decade on tapes that decades later would become treasured and slightly embarrassing artifacts, grainy footage of people who didn't yet know how the rest of their lives were going to turn out. Fashion in the 1980s is, of all the decades we're covering tonight, probably the most immediately recognizable, the most thoroughly caricatured, and the most genuinely beloved by the people who lived through it. Big hair was not optional in many social circles. It was practically mandatory, achieved through a combination of perms, hot rollers, copious amounts of hairspray, and a level of daily maintenance that the following decades would largely abandon. The bigger the hair, in certain corners of 80s culture, the better, and the products and tools developed to achieve maximum volume represent a genuine engineering achievement of the consumer beauty industry. Neon colors dominated casual wear, pink, green, yellow, electric blue, in combinations that would have seemed garish in any other decade and felt, in this one, exactly right. Leg warmers, originally a dance studio accessory, became street fashion. Acid-washed denim with its mottled, faded pattern became a wardrobe staple for an entire generation. The power suit, mentioned earlier in the context of work, extended into a broader aesthetic of bold shoulders, structured silhouettes, and a kind of visual confidence that matched the decade's broader cultural mood of ambition and excess. The 1990s. The year is 1996. You are 22 years old, and you've just landed your first job in your actual field. The thing you went to school for, or the thing you'd been working toward through a string of less directly relevant jobs before this one. You have your own desk, your own phone extension, and increasingly common by this point in the decade, your own computer with an actual internet connection, which still feels, even this far into the decade, like a small miracle every time you use it. The 1990s workplace was the decade in which the internet went from a curiosity to a genuine, if still somewhat novel, professional tool. Email existed and was becoming standard in many workplaces by the middle of the decade, though plenty of offices still ran heavily on phone calls, faxes, and paper memos circulated by hand or interoffice mail. The internet connection itself, if you had one, likely came through a modem that made a specific, now iconic series of screeching, hissing sounds as it connected, a sound that an entire generation can recognize instantly decades later with a sharp pang of recognition. The old technologies of the phone call and the handwritten note were still very much alive, but new technologies were beginning to insert themselves into romance in ways that would only accelerate in the decades that followed. The landline was still primary for most of the decade. Call waiting, the ability to know that a second call was coming in while you were already on the phone, was a genuine source of teenage drama. The agonizing decision of whether to click over and find out who else was calling while leaving the person you were currently talking to in suspended silence, wondering if you'd come back. Pagers, originally a tool for doctors and other professionals who needed to be reachable in emergencies, became, in the mid-90s, a genuine teenage status symbol and communication tool. Getting paged by someone you liked, seeing their number or a coded numeric message light up on the small screen, produced a specific jolt of excitement that an entire generation remembers vividly. You'd find a payphone if you were out and call back, and the whole interaction had a kind of urgency and scarcity to it that later, more constant forms of communication would lack. Instant messaging arrived in the second half of the decade and changed everything, gradually, then suddenly. AOL Instant Messenger, launched in 1997, became the dominant way that an entire generation of teenagers communicated with each other after school. The away message, carefully crafted to convey mood and status and the right amount of mystery. The specific sound of the door opening when someone signed on. The screen name you'd chosen years earlier and now felt stuck with. The buddy list that you'd check obsessively to see who was online. Falling in love over AIM had a specific texture that didn't exist before and doesn't quite exist in the same way now. You could type things you'd never have said out loud. You could take time crafting a response, deleting and rewriting in a way that a face-to-face conversation never allowed. Technology in the 1990s moved from novelty to necessity with startling speed. The internet itself is the obvious centerpiece. The World Wide Web, which had existed in earlier forms since 1991, became genuinely accessible to ordinary consumers through the middle of the decade, as browsers like Netscape Navigator made it possible to actually look at this thing without specialized technical knowledge.
Now they're off home to set up the computer. Are Jenny and Toby confident that they understand everything?
No, rewind it. Rewind it.
Check with.
Yeah, stop.
First of all, we'll connect the power cable.
You've got mail.
AOL's iconic phrase, "You've got mail," became one of the most recognizable sounds in American culture, announcing the arrival of a piece of communication technology that, within a few years, would become utterly unremarkable. But that felt, the first dozen or so times you heard it, like something out of science fiction. Cell phones existed through the decade, but remained, for most of it, large, expensive, and far from universal. The earliest models were genuinely heavy, bricks, in the literal description that became their nickname, with battery life measured in a small number of hours and price tags that put them firmly in the category of luxury business tool rather than everyday teenage accessory. By the very end of the decade, phones had shrunk dramatically and started to become more common among ordinary consumers, including teenagers, setting the stage for the genuinely universal cell phone ownership of the following decade. The CD had fully displaced the cassette as the dominant music format by the early to mid-90s, and the CD player, portable, for the car, for the home stereo system that was, in many households, a genuine piece of furniture and a genuine source of pride, was the way most people listened to music for most of the decade. Napster arrived right at the very end of the decade, in 1999, and the disruption it caused to the music industry, while not fully felt until the following decade, began here, in dorm rooms and bedrooms across the country, downloading songs one at a time over connections, slow enough that a single song could take many minutes to fully arrive. Video game technology made enormous leaps. The Super Nintendo gave way to systems with actual 3D graphics. The Sony PlayStation, launched in 1994, and the Nintendo 64, launched in 1996, represented a genuine generational leap in what games could look like and how they could be played, moving from the flat, side-scrolling worlds of the 80s into fully three-dimensional spaces that felt, at the time, like stepping into the actual future. Fashion in the 1990s was, in many ways, a direct reaction against the excess of the 1980s. A deliberate pulling back from neon and big hair and shoulder pads towards something more muted, more deconstructed, more deliberately undone. Grunge, emerging out of the Pacific Northwest music scene in the very early part of the decade, brought flannel shirts, ripped jeans, combat boots, and a general aesthetic of not trying too hard into mainstream fashion, a genuinely countercultural look that, within a few years, had been thoroughly absorbed and sold back to the mainstream by the same fashion industry it had originally positioned itself against. Hip-hop fashion grew into a massive cultural and commercial force throughout the decade. Baggy jeans, oversized jerseys, specific brands that carried real social weight and meaning within their communities, and increasingly, as the decade progressed, in the broader mainstream culture as well. The slip dress, worn over a t-shirt or alone, became an iconic 90s silhouette, part of a broader minimalist aesthetic that ran through fashion in this decade, a reaction against the maximalism of the previous one. Doc Martens, chokers, butterfly clips, overalls, worn with one strap deliberately undone. Platform sneakers made their own comeback, distinct from the 70s platforms but clearly drawing on the same basic impulse. Boy bands and girl groups dominated the back half of the decade's pop culture, and with them came a specific kind of coordinated, stylized fashion, matching outfits, specific colors, a visual language that an entire generation of preteens and teenagers absorbed and imitated with real devotion. What it all adds up to 30 years. 3 decades, each with its own music, its own technology, its own way of falling in love and finding your first job and figuring out who you were going to be. What strikes you, looking back across all 3 of these decades together, is not really the differences, dramatic as they are. The phone on the wall giving way to the phone in your pocket. The mixtape giving way to the burned CD giving way, eventually, to whatever came after the 90s ended. What strikes you is the consistency underneath all that change. Every decade had a first job that felt, at the time, both completely ordinary and completely momentous. The first proof that you could go out into the world and earn something through your own effort. Every decade had its own technology for managing the specific terror and excitement of trying to reach someone you liked, whether that was a phone with a cord stretched as far as it would go, or a mixtape recorded with agonizing care, or an away message crafted and recrafted until it said exactly the right amount of nothing. Every decade had a place where young people gathered, the diner, the mall, the arcade, that felt, while it lasted, like the entire world, and that would later become, for the people who were there, one of the most powerful nostalgia triggers of their entire lives. It's not really about the polyester vest or the mixtape, or the away message. It's about being young and uncertain and trying to figure out who you are going to become, using whatever tools your particular decade happened to hand you. The tools were different every time. The feeling was exactly the same. If you watched this far, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.